you gotta do me like that? Yeah.
My guest this month is Tansy Hoskins, an author and journalist based in London. In March 2020, she released Footwork: What Your Shoes Are Doing to the World, an exposé of the shoe industry and the damage it is doing to workers, consumers and the planet. Tansy's previous book, Stitched Up, the Anticapitalist Book of Fashion, is one of my favourites, exploring the political issues in fashion. It's a 360-degree view of the issues at stake, looking at everything from Karl Lagerfeld to Karl Marx. Actor Emma Watson chose Stitched Up as one of her favourite books. In her work, Tansy combines environmental concerns with a critique of capitalism and issues facing the global working class. Tansy is at the forefront of not only illuminating the problems facing fashion now, but thinking of how we might build a better future for all. This is Future Heist, conversations with people making change. My name is Rena Neve Smith. Tell me about the book, first of all. Why did you choose shoes, particularly, as a garment that represents so much that needs to change in fashion?
Well, I wanted to write about shoes partly because there hasn't been a critical book on shoes. Most of the books on shoes are more about the design of shoes, and they're they're very beautifully presented books, but I wanted to go deeper into the very fabric of those shoes and the people who made them, and explore how they come into being. And also, shoes were one of the first objects to be globalized and to be made on a truly global scale, scattered all around the world. And I just thought that was a really interesting story and something that needed exploring. And so shoes can be something that tell us more about the world that we live in.
Tell me about that idea that they're one of the first things that's been truly globalized, because of course when we look at the history of fashion production, the Industrial Revolution started in Britain and France and a small part of Europe before spreading out to the rest of the world. So why were shoes one of the first things that have become global?
Because they're relatively simple to make. And because, the primary reason was because you could pay people a lot less if you got them made on the other side of the world than if you got them made in America or Europe. That was the number one consideration. So after the Cold War ended, lots of different markets opened up. So then you suddenly could start producing in China or in Indonesia, and that was just a gold mine. It was a gold rush for labour at that point.
Yeah, definitely. And what is it about shoes particularly? Is it because there's less elements to the construction of shoes in particular?
Well, garments also went overseas very, very, very quickly. But yes, you just need, it's a relatively simple job. I hate the phrase unskilled labour. It's definitely, if anyone's tried making a shoe, I've tried making a shoe, it's really difficult. So it's a skilled job, but it's one that you can be trained to do in a relatively short period of time. And then it's just very, very repetitive. And the biggest cost really involved in making shoes is labour. Is the pay packet of the people who are making them. So if you can slash that pay packet, then you can make far greater profit on the shoes that you're ultimately selling.
Yeah, that is an interesting misconception, isn't it? In, I guess, not just in fashion, but in globalized industrialization. But the idea of skilled and unskilled labor, because actually, fashion, most people know about the sweatshop reality of mass production, but at the same time, when it actually comes to the things that are being made, it actually does take a lot of skill. And so do you think that makes it particularly, the injustice of the pitifully low wages, the awful working conditions, do you think that makes that injustice particularly acute in fashion?
Yes, I do, and I also think that it's an incredibly gendered question. I think this is about how society doesn't value the labour of women, like right across the world. So, you know, the fact that the wages are so low is intimately tied up with the fact that these are jobs being done, you know, like by women. And of course, what we see now is that these are jobs being done by women in the global south. So there is a racist element to the shoe industry and to the fashion industry as well.
Yeah, I think that's especially if reading the statistics about the gender imbalance in the workforce, and it particularly affects women and of course children as well. There's children involved. And then also refugees. Refugees and migrants make up a massive proportion of the workforce in so many parts of the fashion industry. And that's something you talk about in the book, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, that was one of the more disturbing things, was looking into the fact that there are, you know, Syrian refugee children working in basement workshops in Turkey from the age of 6 years old, who are stitching shoes which are then exported to Germany and to Italy and to Britain as well. And you've just got that horrible irony there that the shoes that these refugee children are stitching are welcome across the border. They're welcomed into Britain and Germany and Italy, but the children themselves are not welcome to cross that border. And it's just, it's a very bleak part. It's, we've globalized the labour market, but we've not globalized our common humanity.
You talk as well in the book about how the labour conditions in the shoe production industry in particular are so much further behind clothing production. Why is that?
Yeah, that was one thing I wasn't... that was one thing that I definitely discovered when researching footwork. And so it's partly because there isn't the same spotlight on shoes as there is on clothing. And I think a big part of that is to do with the fact that although there have been fatal factory accidents and fires in the footwear industry, there hasn't been anything on the scale of Rana Plaza, which sent seismic shocks through the fashion industry and put a strong spotlight on fashion and on clothing. So there hasn't been that, and as a result of that, there hasn't been as much NGO scrutiny and as much kind of journalistic scrutiny placed onto shoes. And so as a result, shoe multinational corporations kind of doing mostly whatever they want to do, and as we know, that's never ever good. So you're kind of left with a subcontracted, deregulated industry where conditions are really low, where the whole every point of supply chains are in crisis, from the leather industry and the chemicals that are involved in that to the glues that are being used. The whole thing is a mess, and it urgently needs regulation.
How did you come across that? Because I know that you, through your previous research and through the journalism work that you do, you have done a lot of research around the fashion industry and the garment industry as a whole, including shoes. And so at what point did you realise that there was this imbalance between shoes and garment production?
Well, it was partly from interviewing people who are experts on the industry and people who've been campaigning in this, and sort of gathering their opinion. And there was this consensus that, look, shoes are at least a decade behind the rest of the fashion industry in terms of standards and regulation. And then also just kind of just the things that you see. You going into a shoe factory, like the ones that I visited in Eastern Europe, and you are immediately hit by a very strong chemical smell that gives you a headache within, literally within half an hour. I had a headache, my eyes hurt, my nose was hurting, and it's like you don't get that in your average garment factory where people are just on sewing machines. So and then kind of looking into more of the research about the chemicals that are in this and what people are breathing every day. So the conditions, the material conditions are just worse in footwear.
Can you explain, because a lot of people might not be aware of this, but what is it about fashion that leaves the system so open to this downward crush of worker standards? Because you talk about how the production of shoes represents the interdependencies and injustices shaping our world, and the fashion industry has a very particular way of making things, or how we make clothes and how we make shoes is quite particular as opposed to other products, in that it does have a longer production line, basically. Can you explain a little bit about that for the listener?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to the fact that one of the things that is hidden about, not just about clothing and about shoes, but basically about everything, is that the two things that make everything that we have is, number one is human labour, and number two is natural resources, like the biosphere. Within that I would include the animal kingdom as well. And so what every corporation wants to do is maximise the profits that it makes, and on each item that it makes. And so first of all, what we've had is the natural world being treated like it's a completely free resource, and like this, so that there's no consequences. Like water is free, and air is free, and the land, the soil is free. And we're now living with the consequences of that. And then the other thing that they have to squeeze is labour. And so unless you have slaves, and some sections of the fashion industry do run on literal slavery, but unless you have slaves, you have to pay a wage. And so people are literally rewarded for driving these wages down and down and down. And so those are the two elements that go into fashion and go into footwear and everything else. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it absolutely made sense. And then I guess the other thing is there's a lack of accountability as well, isn't there? Because the brands who people are buying from and who people recognise are not the people who own the factories. Isn't that right? Yeah,
so I mean, I guess, that's a very particular, or something fashion does very well, is that the brands, in the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s and early 2000s, severed the link between branding and manufacturing. So it's incredibly rare now to have a fashion corporation who owns any factories. Britain, Europe, America used to be full of factories. Now that's not the case. They've outsourced it. So it's incredibly subcontracted, and the whole supply chain is completely deregulated, because obviously the other benefit of no longer producing in England but going over to Bangladesh or the Philippines or wherever is that you suddenly, look, all these pesky environmental regulations have gone, all these regulations about providing healthcare and maternity care and creches, and a living wage, that's all gone. What a lovely corporate playground we now have.
Absolutely. And in Bangladesh, I was reading that 80% of the export industry in Bangladesh relies on the garment trade, and they employ an industrial police force who literally crack down on any union activity. So it really is a corporate playground. It's a country that's entirely gearing itself towards international corporations coming in and using its workforce.
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, it's and that's terrifying. I mean, number one, to have your economy so exposed to a single industry is a terrible idea. So I'm very worried about what the future will look like for Bangladesh, whether through the rise of automation or whether because companies decide that wages in Bangladesh have gone above a certain threshold and then jog on to like Ethiopia or wherever. So Bangladesh incredibly overexposed and very, very scary. And then like you say, I think what people need to remember is that a lot of the time the politicians in Bangladesh are intimately linked with the factory owning class, to the extent that often you'll have politicians who will also own factories. or you'll have factory owners who are like retired army generals, or so it's a kind of like horrible Victorian style system where the workers are literally up against like a kind of old school ruling class bloc.
Yeah.
That will take whatever extreme measures it needs to keep the factories running.
It really does feel Victorian, which is why I find it really interesting reading either Marx or what Marx had to say about the fashion industry, because the conditions really haven't changed very much since the 19th century, and if anything, they've just rolled out to around the world. It's really frightening.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about something you've just touched on briefly, but the environment as well. Shoes, most of them aren't recycled. You talk about that in the book. The link between this overproduction of one single item and the impact it's having on the planet is massive.
Yes, it's terrifying. And it's terrifying when you think of like that we're making, like one of the scary statistics I found was that we make 66.3 million pairs of shoes every single year. And, I was lucky to go up to some laboratories that are based at Loughborough University. And yeah, they were saying, 90% of shoes are not recycled. So there's this whole section of like the supply chain that I still don't think we talk about it enough, is that like what happens after that object is not with you anymore. Like where does it go? And for shoes, 90% of the time they're not being recycled. So like where are they going?
Yeah.
And what consequences is that having on the planet if we're just burying this stuff that is going to be there in 1,000 years' time?
Absolutely. Something I think I found really interesting, which you talked about in Stitched Up, was the conversation around fast fashion. Because you were talking about the way consumers get blamed and how that's really wrong, actually, for corporations to turn around and say that individuals need to buy better. Has this research around shoes confirmed those thoughts that you had about fast fashion?
Yes, it definitely has. I mean, I'm really keen to avoid basically class shaming people, and I think a lot of the time sustainability movements kind of fall into that trap, and it's just like it's really not people's fault if they don't have the money to save up to buy like a £200 pair of trousers or whatever. The ability to save money is a condition of class. And I think a lot of the time people don't remember that enough. And yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely shoes has completely confirmed that. It's like the longer lasting shoes are the expensive shoes. It's like if you go into somewhere like Shoe Zone, it's like people, you can buy a pair of boots for £15, and they're not going to last. But that's not the fault of the person who only has £15 to buy a pair of shoes for themselves or for their child. So yeah, it's horrible. But eventually we need a restructuring of our society so that we have a level playing field and that everybody can afford nice things.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that idea of we have the resources to create a world where people have things that last, and we don't need to treat things as disposable or try and treat things which were possibly intended to be disposable as trying to make them last.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, it's not just, in terms of shoe consumption, like, it's not equal. It's like, yeah, we make 66 million pairs of shoes a year, but like the consumption is obviously not equal on a global level, but it's not equal within within Britain, within London. It's like you've got people with 1,000 pair of shoes, and then you've got people with like one pair.
Another thing that I'm going to bring up briefly as well, which I really liked in Stitched Up, was when you were talking about the brand Tom's and how they give a pair of shoes for every pair that's bought. And you were talking about, and I hadn't thought about this before, but you were talking about the fact that that's treating a symptom of poverty, not the cause of poverty itself. So of course people who are poor don't have access to footwear, but just giving them shoes isn't going to take away their problems. I thought that was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, well, I love. There's that. I think it's Desmond Tutu. I think it's Desmond Tutu who said, like, we've got to stop like fishing people out of the river. We need to go upstream and work out why people are falling into the river. You know, that's the challenge. So yeah, like at some point, you can't just keep fishing people out of the river. You have to find out what's really going on.
Definitely. I want to talk about your background. I remember when I was reading Stitched Up, you were talking about how you had, and I think this absolutely came across in the book, you had a clarity because you weren't coming to the fashion industry from the perspective of a fashion journalist. You talked about the way that fashion press is really glorified advertising. And as somebody who trained as a fashion journalist, I thought this was so true. And I thought, like I say, I think that clarity really came across in the book, which allowed you to be really critical. What brought you to write Stitched Up?
Well, I wrote Stitched Up in order to answer the questions that I had about the world, which I think is often one of the firmest kind of starting points for a book or a big project. And for me, like I grew up, in the sort of 90s when Primark first existed. Me and my friend could go to Hounslow High Street. We could buy shoes for £7. That was like heaven on a Saturday. But I was all kind of always aware, like that I could shop and shop and shop, come home with loads of bags of basically rubbish, and then wake up the next day and want to do it all over again. So a lot of it was kind of like, what is going on internally? Why is there this black hole that I could never fill up? So it was questions of that, and then friends who had eating disorders, kind of like what is going on there? What is the impact of our visual culture? And then I've always been interested in the environment, and then workers' rights started to become more important. And while I'm interested in fashion, I enjoy the creativity of it, but like you say, fashion doesn't pay my bills, so I was free. I was free to say whatever I wanted. I don't want to be hired by a fashion brand. No fashion brand in its right mind would want to hire me, so I could say whatever I wanted, and I think that was really necessary for that book.
Yeah, and it was interesting then to see that you've written for The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the iPaper and ID, and you've also written for The Business of Fashion, talking about sustainability and talking about crises that fashion's going through. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, that was the very early days of Business of Fashion. Mm-hmm. And then we ended up like parting company because I think they're not radical in any real sense. And I pitched some stuff, and it wasn't working, and also they never paid me for anything. So really? But it was good to get some of those opinions into that world. But they should pay journalists and be more radical.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I was at London Fashion Week last weekend, and there's one thing that was really obvious was that there was much more model diversity on the catwalks in terms of size than I've seen before. But also the British Fashion Council were talking about sustainability a lot. They had a swap shop organised. Mother of Pearl hosted a sustainability event. But I wondered what you thought of this idea of sustainability and whether it's a buzzword and something that people might like to be seen to be talking about, or whether the industry really is capable of change.
Yes, good question. I mean, I think Extinction Rebellion have done a very good job of making the environmental impact of fashion unavoidable at Fashion Week, and I think the moves that we did see in this February's Fashion Week were a response to them. Is it enough? No, it's absolutely not enough. You know, are we basically seeing every brand kind of just print the word sustainability like willy-nilly on everything? Yes. But does fashion need to change? Absolutely. Like, either they change or climate change is going to change the industry and the world irrevocably. You know, like, the climate scientist consensus is that we now have 11 years in which to halt runaway climate catastrophe, and fashion is supposed to be about the future. And this is what I always say. It's like fashion is obsessed with the future, but we are in a moment where fashion is unable to kind of comprehend what is coming at it and what it has helped to create as well. So
that is a really interesting contradiction, actually, because we've just talked as well about Victorian working conditions. And as somebody who works in fashion, I find that the people who are least willing to be the first to do something are actually people in fashion. It makes me laugh that something will come along and everyone will say, oh, that's awful, and then all of a sudden everyone's doing it. And I feel like there's this thing where it's the idea of being part of the future, and it's kind of pro-change, which I've sort of observed over time, and I don't know what that says about people, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, I don't know what the means will be. I mean, I personally think there's going to have to be regulation. I don't think we will have a situation where a single brand or a single company will be able to go far enough by itself, even if they really wanted to, because all their competitors won't be doing that. So I think there has to be, we have to do them a favour by making it very clear what they legally can and can't do.
Yeah, I think regulation definitely has to come into it. And I think you're right. I think the model of capitalism is so competitive between brands that even the issue of size, even the issue of getting models that look more like ordinary people than this very unreal aesthetic, even getting that kind of change has been a really hard slog.
Yeah.
And remains like something which has a long, long way to go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what do you think about the idea that it's not just that fashion companies are held back, but capitalism as a whole is geared towards conservatism?
Yes, I think with regards to climate, like, it is geared towards being conservative, towards being backwards, basically. I mean, and it's because the two pillars are profit and competition. Outdoing your competitors, squeezing as much as you can out of your labour and out of the planet. It's not geared. It's not geared towards doing anything other than that. It's deeply depressing. Yeah.
So you say that the source of all wealth is the planet and human work, and we have what it takes to create a more equal society. So what would that look like for you?
Within the fashion industry, or
I think both.
Both. Well, so I mean that's the big question. I mean, for me, fashion without capitalism for me would be very, very exciting and interesting. I think there's kind of two points that I think here. So the first one is that I think if you want to see the exact impact of fashion, of capitalism on fashion, is you have to go back to Rana Plaza. And you have to go back to that morning in April 2013. And what a lot of people don't realise is that there was an argument outside the factory just before it collapsed between the managers and the workers. And the workers knew that the building was unsafe and they didn't want to go inside. And eventually the manager said if people didn't go back in and get to work, that they would lose like a day's pay, which is, or more, in fact, which is impossible. So the workers were forced to go back inside that factory. And for me, that's the moment where we see the impact of capitalism, where we see that the lives of those young women were judged to be less important than the products, the clothing that they were stitching on those sewing machines. So first of all, you would never have that drive to mass produce stuff to the extent that it it overrules the sanctity of human life. You would have like worker control of the factories. Immediately that would cut production down, because nobody is going to vote or make themselves work like a 70-hour week. Everyone, they'll make sure they pay each other, and so production, it would immediately fall. And then at the same time, one of the things I think is really exciting about fashion without capitalism is the design possibilities. And because at the moment, fashion is governed by loads of stupid rules that aren't real. They're just so pink for girls, blue for boys, trousers for men, skirts for women, high heels, all of these things. And then the class rules, so what people can wear to work, what it's acceptable to wear in certain social situations, sexuality, people aren't free to express themselves, the rules around race and fashion. So all these really destructive things. And then also most people don't get the chance to really, really be creative within fashion. Design is kind of on lockdown at the moment. There's there's sort of 1% who get to do the fun stuff, and then everyone else just gets to kind of buy what they can afford. And I think if people had more autonomy and involvement in design, then also they would be more connected to the clothes that they have as well. So I think fashion without capitalism would be really exciting, and for me that's autonomy of yourself and of your community and of your workplace, and of the planet that we live in, and living within the means of the planet, not living in order to make profit for giant multinational corporations who don't care about any of us.
Yeah, and actually sometimes I think don't even really, I don't know, sometimes you get a sense that big fashion companies don't even care about the art of fashion, if that makes sense. They're just pumping out these clothes, right?
Yeah.
They don't really care, you know what I mean? Versus people who really care about fashion as an art form. It's just another product, and another product to be sold and to make that profit on, and not really about the art. I mean, capitalism really does kind of suck the life and joy out of things.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and like you said, a lot of fashion on the high street is very boring. But even a lot of high fashion is boring. Couture and stuff. I mean, it's still for a market, and I would argue an increasingly conservative market at the moment. So it's not the best that we could do at all.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And I think what you just said throws up a whole load of things as well, like the fact that our grandmother's generation knew how to make clothes and knew how to even alter things that they maybe would buy, or they would make things from pattern. And there was a lot of problems in that it was often women's work, and it would fall to women to do that unpaid at home. But still, there's a loss of those skills. And it's interesting now when we admire each other's clothes, most of the time it's you shopped well. That's what you're really congratulating somebody on. They found something in a shop. I mean, it's not. But yeah, it's really interesting. To think of fashion without capitalism, because they are so linked. I mean, capitalism infuses everything that we do, right? So what about production? Do you think that we'd be producing a lot less as well, and without capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, we should be producing for what we need, and to an extent what we want as well. What we want, what we need. What we're doing at the moment is producing to what shareholder capitalism needs, and that is not benefiting. It's not benefiting you and I. It's not benefiting anyone. It's not benefiting the people making the clothes. It's not benefiting the people kind of on this hamster wheel of consumerism. And it's sure as hell is not benefiting the planet in any way. In fact, it's destroying it. number one cause of Amazon deforestation is cattle farming, you know, and 50% of everything made from leather is shoes. So it's like, you know, do we really want to chop down the Amazon to have a new pair of shoes? It's like these kind of questions.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we're living in a time warp where we have these ways of producing things which just are so outdated and yeah, you know, like treating things as disposable, like we're in the Midwest in the 19th century and we've just discovered
yes
white people have just discovered
yeah.
a virgin land or whatever. Tell me about your activism in general then, because I was reading that you were involved in Stop the War Coalition and the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So what's your journey into activism been?
So I was brought up in a very, like, in a left-wing kind of vegetarian, old Labour household. I was at university when the war, so-called war on terror started. So, you know, the attacks on Afghanistan and the attacks on Iraq, and that kind of completed my like political education. I've been involved in stuff like Reclaim the Streets and things like that before, but then yes, like Stop the War. You know, that moment. You know, just like when the Twin Towers were attacked, and then when Afghanistan was attacked, Iraq was attacked. That just like, you know, exploded my world view of everything. And then I went to work for Stop the War straight out of university, and then campaign for nuclear disarmament as well, and so I don't know, it's just like oxygen to me. I've just always been doing that kind of thing, and trying to make politics like accessible as well. That's like one of my big passions, and it's partly why I started writing about fashion, is because I don't think the left should leave any stone unturned. Like, I think if we're not talking about fashion, then you just leave it up to, like, you know, the neoliberal agenda, and I think that would be really bad. So that was one of the reasons I was like, no one's writing about this, like we should be.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking as somebody who's on the left and who loves fashion, it feels like that was I think one of the most amazing things about your book was that you were speaking with such clarity and such great analysis of the industry and coming at it from a left-wing perspective. And why do you think the left does have such a problem with talking about fashion?
Oh, I don't know. It's hard. I don't know if it's like, I think there is a certain amount of snobbery around, and that it's it's not seen as like serious, which is ridiculous. I expect there's a certain amount of sexism in it as well, in that, you know, this is quote unquote women's work and quote unquote like women's pastimes and stuff. But also, I mean, like, I think at the same time, like, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on, and I think we had some time before 9/11 where the anti-globalization movement was really good on sweatshops and was really good on like Nike and, you know, globalization and corporate power, but 9/11 really kind of snookered that. You know, then it had to then just be all about Iraq and Afghanistan, and so there was a moment that was lost, which I think is that is one of the huge tragedies of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that we got knocked, like the environmental movement got knocked back, the anti-corporate movement got knocked back, and we lost a decade at least.
And a lot of, not new, but in new forms, issues came up like racism and Islamophobia and things, didn't they, with that? And it did create like a whole load of other things that people wanted to focus on, and there's only so much resources that people have.
Yeah, I mean, that was like, I talk about that in Footwork. It's like we had the anti-globalization movement was so global, and one of the central bits was global solidarity. So it was kind of us, and then and then all the hideous rhetoric around the war on terror made it like about like us and them, and like the West versus Islam and all this like awful rubbish, and so kind of knocked a lot of people's view, and so then you're having to fight on like, no, we're like going back, like just going back to the basics of like we're all on the same side kind of thing. And then you had Occupy, who were good at kind of bringing that into the kind of 99% and 1%. But we lost a lot of time.
Yeah. And how have things changed since then? Because, I mean, now we've got Donald Trump in the White House. We've got, it feels like, and the environment. Do you think the environmental issues are bringing corporate responsibility back into the equation in the way that they were in the conversation before the war on terror?
Not enough. I really think not enough. I think we are still we're still thinking too much about ourselves, and we're still looking at these issues in terms of like what can I do about my own wardrobe or my own food cupboard or my own makeup bag or whatever. I don't think we're back to having the kind of systemic analysis that we had in the late 90s, which we, and that's one of the things I really hope to be able to help with, is that kind of like pushing that political education on like, this is not your fault. Yes, individual change is a factor, it's important, but it's not like, you can do that till you're blue in the face. Like, it's not going to change the world. Yeah,
I read that there's corporations who have the carbon footprint in a year of the entire population of France. Pushing it back onto the individual to change, and talking about veganism and all these things, as great as it is to try and do your bit, is really shifting the focus of responsibility away from the people who really have the power.
Yeah, completely. I mean, we've had this massive growth in corporate power over the last few decades, and it's not been matched by a growth in global governance or global legislation or anything. So they're just, it's the Wild West analogy again. They're just off doing whatever they want to do, and we need to act really fast. And part of that is kind of people letting go of the idea that all they can do is shop differently.
Very good. It's true. I'm going to go on to the last questions now.
Oh, yes.
So the first question is, how can people support you and what you do?
Well, I think what I would love at the moment is for people to track down a copy of Footwork. I've been working on the book basically by myself since 2017, and I would just love for people to read it and to give me not footnotes, to give me feedback, give me some feedback on what they think and whether it's useful and stuff, and whether you could buy it or get university or library to order some copies and stuff.
Definitely. And how can people reach you? Are you on Twitter?
Yep, I am on Twitter and Instagram as @Tansy Hoskins. I am also on Facebook. I've got an author page on Facebook. I'm on Goodreads. I'm trying to tick all the boxes.
Yeah, you're out there. You are online.
Online. Got my website @tansyhoskins.org.
Brilliant. And my next question is there anything you can think of that people can, apart from obviously Footwork, that people can read or watch to inspire them to make change? Anything that's inspired you in the past?
Yeah, I've got a weird suggestion. I mean, so obviously there's shelves full of fantastic left-wing texts. We've talked about Marx, and Trotsky and Engels and Rosa Luxemburg. All those, this all exists. But there's a really cool fiction book that I would quite like to recommend, because it's the book that kind of gives me a really clear vision of how things could be very, very different. And it really interestingly talks about clothing as well in a really exciting just dynamic, really, really interesting way. That doesn't go, it doesn't kind of shirk on design or anything. It's really interesting. And that book is Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy. And it's a book, it came out in the late 70s, and it's a very feminist book. My one warning is that 50% of it is set in a violent, hospital, like what you would call a kind of insane asylum back in the day. And so I would put lots of content warnings on it. But the bits that aren't in the hospital are just like extraordinary. It's like a whole new society. It's amazing.
That sounds really exciting. Thank you for that. And then the last question, which I ask everyone, is what would your advice, or how would you say that people can get involved more generally in change?
Well, I think the good news is that there are lots of really interesting and well-organised groups of people who are already doing this. So my first thing would be basically pick the issue that you are really passionate about, or pick several issues, and then go probably online and just find the groups that are already doing stuff. So for the fashion industry, for example, in United Kingdom, you already have War on Want, Labour Behind the Label. You've got Extinction Rebellion, the fashion section of that, who are doing really exciting things. You've got Trade. So there's lots of groups who are already doing stuff. I would also say, and then find other people. Like, it's kind of like collectively changing stuff, and just getting out there. Basically, connect with people, go on demonstrations, find more like-minded people. Like blog, take photographs, make art, write books, write articles. We've got to demonstrate that the alternative to capitalism and neoliberalism is better. We can attract more people in.
Yeah, definitely, because I think that works in so many ways, because of course when you make those personal connections, it really helps you to get involved in those things, and it's amazing when you find people who are thinking the same way as you. But then also, of course, we are stronger together, right?
Yes.
More people doing things together is gonna affect
yes,
change.
we need to demand change. I mean, I often think, read a lot of people who are kind of giving a lot of advice about how to shop differently, and there's a lot of that happening I see a lot of it on Instagram and stuff. It must be like hundreds, if not thousands, of people doing that, and I just often think, I wish you lot would all just get together. If you lot all got together and just decided to go and have a demonstration or something, it would be thousands of you, or pick one political demand and all write a letter to your MP or to British Fashion Council or whoever you pick, and kind of collectively act. It'd be a huge boost to the fashion change movement.
That is a brilliant place to end. Thank you so much for sitting down with me, Tansy. It's been such an interesting conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Future Heist is recorded and produced by me, Rena Neve Smith, with original music by Benjamin Tassi, artwork by Fleur Beck, and sound editing by Gibran Farah. Special thanks to Chloe Vasegi and Joshua Los Challens. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at future_heist.